My childhood wasn't the happiest time in my life, even though I had everything I needed as far as food and material things. But my parents hated each other and fought constantly. They thought they were doing me a favor by staying married, but secretly, all I ever wanted was for them to go their separate ways. It wasn't even the constant chaos surrounding them that got to me. It was the total lack of love that did the most harm. Their resentment for each other was palpable, and I think it was partly why I went years without any friends. I didn't know what a healthy relationship looked like. There was a long period of time where I became totally withdrawn, and when I look back at it, I was probably going through some form of adolescent depression. During that time, and probably in an attempt to make things better for me, my dad built an extremely nice treehouse in the giant maple tree we had at our summer house. He put a lot of money and effort into it using his skills as an engineer, and actually hired a contractor he knew to build the thing. It took a full summer to finish, but the result was a literal tiny house with power 20 feet off the ground. I think he worked so hard on it because he thought a treehouse would help me make new friends, and I'm sure he was hoping other kids would see it and want to come over. Sadly, he was wrong about that, mostly because our neighbors were very spread out, but I was still excited about having a space like that to myself. I spent countless days and nights in that treehouse playing Nintendo DS and reading comic books, and at night I would look at the moon through my telescope or occasionally climb onto the roof to look at the stars. I was afraid of the dark like most kids, but my dad put in a hardwired nightlight strip and a system where I could pull up the rope ladder and close a hatch so I felt safe from whatever might be down on the ground. At the end of the summer, and this was in 2008, I was up on the roof to watch the Perseids. That's the annual meteor shower associated with the comet Swift-Tuttle. I don't remember a lot from that age outside of school, but I remember this particular night in detail. Usually I would come back in the house before my parents went to bed, but because of the meteor shower, I was allowed to stay the night in the treehouse. Whenever I did this, I could always come inside if I needed to because we never locked the doors. I can remember the peace and quiet of being up there, and I loved it. There was no light pollution, and I was seeing one shooting star after another. I must have counted 20 of them until I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Right above our property, but hundreds of feet up, there was a large, shapeless shadow in the sky. It was darker than everything else around it, and I think the reason I could see it at all was because there were no stars behind it. I don't know why, but it put this sense of dread in me where it felt like I was being watched. I stayed on the roof looking at other parts of the sky, but my eyes would keep going back to that spot, and after a few minutes it had me spooked. I climbed back down into the treehouse and got in my sleeping bag, which was laid out on a cot. Then I pulled it around me and started playing a game. I'm not sure how much time went by after getting off the roof, possibly 10 or 15 minutes, but while I was in my sleeping bag, I heard something outside in our yard. I shut my game off and just barely looked out one side of the small window facing the house, and I could not believe what I was seeing. There were two people, or rather dark figures that looked like the shapes of people, standing in the center of our backyard. They were facing each other like they were talking, but I couldn't hear anything. Seeing this scared me more than anything I have ever experienced, and I didn't know what to do about it. In typical fashion, I chose the dumbest option by turning off the nightlight strip next to my cot. It wasn't a bright light by any means, but it was noticeable, and you could easily see it turn off or on from the house if it was dark out. I think I realized how stupid it was after the fact, so it took me a second to look out the window again. When I did, I only saw one of the figures in our yard. The other one was gone, but the one I could see was walking full stride up to our house. I watched him cut across the lawn, then onto the patio and right up to the back door, which was unlocked. I wanted to yell for my parents more than anything, but I was too scared to do it. Then I saw this figure open the door and walk inside. It's hard for me to explain just how terrifying that was to see. I was completely paralyzed and only remember repeating the words, "Oh my God," in my head. The only thing I could do was sit there and helplessly watch. In a matter of seconds, I heard my mom scream, and it echoed across the yard since the back door was still open. It was the scariest and most disturbing sound I think I've ever heard, and it made me jump back from the window to the corner of the treehouse. What happened after that is a blur to me, but I remember pulling a coat over my head and putting my hands over my ears. In my mind, I was just waiting for one of these intruders to come up and grab me, but that never happened. I have no recollection of anything after that. I only remember hearing my dad's voice and he was calling me from below the treehouse. This was very startling and it's what woke me up, but it was also a huge relief. When I finally pulled the coat off my head, I could not believe the sun had already come up. I opened the window and yelled to my dad, then he came out from under the tree and was standing there perfectly fine. The only thing he said was there was breakfast inside if I wanted any. As I climbed down to the ground, I was noticeably shaking. Then I immediately started to ask him about the men breaking in. I told him I had seen them in our yard and actually watched the one go into our house. Then I asked about my mom screaming. He was beyond confused by what I was saying and kept telling me none of it happened. One of my clearest memories of this is walking up to the house with him that morning because he put his hand on the back of my neck and said it was just a dream. I'm glad my parents were okay, but he couldn't have been more wrong. I did not dream it. I actually watched it and I was wide awake. I continued talking about it while we were eating breakfast, but he insisted nothing had happened. He even told me that if my mom had actually screamed like that, there was no way he wouldn't have heard it, and I knew that was a valid point. It still didn't matter though, because I was positive I wasn't dreaming. Even today, I know what I saw was real, and I know for a fact that my mom was screaming about something. What I don't understand is how I fell asleep in the middle of it. When it was happening, the only scenario in my head was that two men were breaking in, but later in my teens, I started to question that. They seemed to just appear in our yard minutes after I had seen that dark shadow above our property. That makes me think I wasn't seeing things and there was actually something up there, and maybe the two figures I saw weren't people. I also thought a lot about when I shut my nightlight off. There were two of them standing together in the middle of the yard. Then when the light went out and I looked again, there was only one, and that's the one that went into the house. I never saw them split up or where the other one went. I find that fact so unsettling because it could have gone underneath the treehouse or actually come up into it and I don't remember. It seems completely impossible that I would just fall asleep for the rest of the night, and I really don't like to think about that. A friend of mine who knows the story told me that falling asleep during a stressful situation could have been a defense mechanism since I was so young, and I suppose that makes some sense. But I have also heard about people losing large chunks of time during unexplained sightings, and that's exactly what I'd call the object I saw. I think something happened to me and my parents that night, but I don't know what it was. I'm positive about what I saw, but I have no memory after pulling the coat over my head. I really think my parents saw something in our house too, and that's why I heard my mom scream. But they obviously don't remember anything either, and that makes me feel like it was on purpose and we weren't supposed to remember. I was born and raised in San Diego, California, and grew up in the Allied Gardens and San Carlos neighborhoods. I had a very normal childhood in middle-class suburbia and came from a blue-collar family. In high school, I was a police explorer, which is a membership program that introduces young adults to careers in law enforcement, and later after graduation, I joined the California Army National Guard. When I wasn't on duty with the Guard, I worked a security job at a popular San Diego tourist venue along San Diego Bay. Back then, I had a close-knit group of friends who all loved adventuring in the backcountry of San Diego County. The Laguna Mountains were our go-to spot with pine forests and tons of dirt roads to take nighttime adventures on. But when we didn't have time to get out there, another area east of Chula Vista called Proctor Valley was our usual alternative. Proctor Valley has much more open space and is located behind the south slope of San Miguel Mountain, directly north of Upper Otay Reservoir. On the south side of that valley, there's a ridge and a dirt road that runs the length of the valley, and it eventually spits you out into a rural area off of State Highway 94. One night in May of 1999, we had all clocked out from a swing shift at the same time. Then we decided to pile into my Jeep Cherokee and head out to Proctor Valley for some off-roading and late-night target shooting. The skies were perfectly clear, but I did notice the humidity was higher than normal. As we entered Proctor Valley, we turned our radio scanner on to monitor Border Patrol. They were always patrolling out there and it could be a pain, so we made every effort to avoid them. As we drove down the dirt road, we passed Upper Otay Reservoir and crossed a small creek. Just past that creek, there's a curve in the road and a grove of large eucalyptus trees, and that's where we stopped. When we got out of the Jeep, we were all just hanging out and talking, mostly about work and women, and enjoying being out there. I remember casually looking up and watching jetliners fly over that were heading into Lindbergh Field while listening to the chatter from Border Patrol units. We hadn't been out of the car for more than 10 minutes when we noticed several lights moving along the top of the ridge on the south side of the valley. They were extremely unusual and looked like an array of spotlights that might be coming down from a helicopter. Another thing that struck me as strange is they were a very obvious and eerie yellow color. Normally, the night sun spotlights used by police and Border Patrol helicopters are a brilliant white or blue color. These lights looked nothing like that. Whatever they were, we watched them and we figured it was most likely something with Border Patrol. As they got closer, we could see the brush on the ground under the lights clearly illuminated, and whatever aircraft it was appeared to be about 200 feet off the ground. We all stood there and watched them move west along the ridge in the direction of Upper Otay Reservoir. Then when they reached the far west end, they lifted up into the sky, made a turn, and started coming in our direction. It was really at that moment when I think we all noticed there was no engine noise and no sound of rotor blades, which really got our attention. As this thing made its way closer to us, the scanner in my Jeep started to break up and crackle, and there was an immediate feeling of a heavy static charge in the air. It was enough to make the hair on our arms stand up. Then we finally got a solid view of what was in the air, and it was absolutely not a helicopter. These lights were coming from the underside of a perfect black triangle. We were completely mesmerized by what we were seeing, with an equal combination of amazement and fear. While we were watching this, a low humming sound crept in, and it reminded me of the hum an electric transformer makes. Out of nowhere, one of my buddies made the horrible decision to take out his powerful flashlight and start to shine it at the craft. When he did that, it made this slight turn and started to drift straight toward us. Instant panic set in, and everyone was yelling that we needed to get out of there as we piled back into my Jeep. Out of raw fear, I drove to the east instead of west, back towards Chula Vista. I was literally driving as fast as I could go without losing control, and every one of my friends was shouting at me to go faster. In the middle of this chaos, I remember one thing very clearly. I kept looking in my rearview and side view mirrors, and I could perfectly see that bright yellow light illuminating the road behind us. It felt like there was nothing we could do and no way we could even get away from it. When we finally got to the end of the dirt road and hit pavement again, there was a small rural neighborhood we had to get through to make it to Highway 94, and I believe that's where I stopped seeing the light in my mirrors. At the end of that neighborhood, there was a gas station and mini market, so I pulled into their parking lot and stopped. We must have sat in the car speechless and actually shaking for several minutes before anyone said anything. None of us could believe what had just happened. It took us a long time to gather our senses after this, but eventually we drove back into Chula Vista and I dropped my buddies off where they had parked their cars. What is so unbelievably strange is that we never spoke about it again after that night. I don't have any explanation for that. A couple of years after this happened, we all went our separate ways, and that's when I went into law enforcement. My friends went on to join the U.S. Customs Service and the San Diego County Sheriff's Department, and unfortunately one of them passed away after drinking himself to death. I also want to mention that I had some very weird, longer-lasting effects from that encounter. I started to experience almost poltergeist-like activity at my house afterward, and it went on for months. One notable thing was with my TV remote. I would always set it in the same place on my nightstand, then it would just go missing and I would find it weeks later in other rooms or in a closet, and once I even found it in the attic of my house. I also had a girlfriend at that time who was terrified to stay at my house because she swore she heard voices. I don't know if any of that was related to what we saw or not, but it seems like a pretty big coincidence. I have no idea what happened to us or what we witnessed flying over Proctor Valley, but that experience is something I will never forget. About a year ago, I had to cover for one of the assistant managers at our store for a whole pay period, which meant I ended up working side by side with our main manager, Alan. I knew Alan fairly well prior to that week, but we had never done any full shifts together like that until then. We ended up having a ton in common, and we would talk endlessly about all kinds of random things while we were working. One night it was totally dead and we had virtually nothing to do, so we were cleaning and talking for the last few hours. Somehow we got onto the topic of UFO sightings, and I mentioned some story a friend of mine had. Then Alan got quiet for a second and said he had an experience with 2 coworkers that he believed to be an actual alien encounter. Like anyone in their right mind would do, I begged him to tell me what happened, so he told me the entire story. I'll try not to butcher it too much, but this is what he said. When he was 19, his first job was at a gas station convenience store where he grew up in Farmington, New Mexico. I believe he said this was sometime in 2002, and he was only working there for the summer to buy this Marshall tube amp. He had been in a band then and thought they were going to make it big until real life slapped him back into reality. Those were his words, by the way, not mine. Then he went on to say there were 3 of them working that night until close. He was behind the counter while another guy was stocking shelves. Then the third guy, whose name was Chris, was outside taking a smoke break on the side of the building where the bathrooms were. He made it a point to explain that Chris could still clearly see the gas pumps and the parking lot from where he was at. If anyone pulled in, he would have seen them. Sometime around 10 o'clock, a guy walked in and Alan said he stood out like a sore thumb. He had on black pants, black Doc Martens-style boots, a dark trench coat, and one of those Irish-style flat caps that was also black. He told me the guy wasn't necessarily sketchy looking. It was just really unusual for that area, especially late at night. I guess the guy didn't say a word when he walked in either. He just calmly went toward the refrigerators that were on the back wall, and that's when the first weird thing happened. Down on the very bottom shelf in the refrigerator where the bottled water was, they had a few gallon-sized jugs sitting there. These were the same jugs that milk comes in, but filled with water. And in the 6 months he worked there, he never saw anyone else buy one of these. But this guy grabbed one and slowly walked it up to the counter. Alan also mentioned that the entire time he was in the store, he moved in this extremely relaxed and slow way. Not like he was drunk or high on something, just unbelievably calm, and it was almost uncomfortable. When he finally brought the jug up to the counter, Alan says his eyes just about took his breath away. They had this pale blue-gray color with a dark ring around the iris, but on a whole other level. He described them as wolf eyes, and on top of that, he said this guy's skin was flawless. Alan was actually laughing during this part and said if he wasn't straight, he would have hit on the guy because he was so good looking. I guess it was the most perfect mix of complexion and eyes that he'd ever seen, like some kind of model or actor. The guy spoke to him like anyone else would, though, and his voice was completely normal and polite. Alan also remembered exactly how much the water cost. It was $1.89, and that detail always stuck with him because the guy pulled out a handful of loose change to pay for it. But I guess mixed in with the change, there were these other little objects that got his attention. He described them as small metal triangles, except they weren't flat. They were 3-dimensional, like tiny polished pyramids that were the size of raisins. He said there were at least a dozen of them mixed in with the coins in his hand. The man calmly picked through the pile and separated out 8 quarters one by one, and it was awkward because the guy was moving so slowly. Eventually, he handed the quarters over and told him he didn't need change, then picked up the gallon of water and walked out of the store. The second the doors closed, he and the other employee immediately started freaking out about how weird the guy was and how crazy the interaction had been. His coworker even admitted that he was nervous the entire time because he thought the guy was going to pull out a shotgun from under his trench coat. Not long after the guy left, their third coworker, Chris, finally came back in from his smoke break, and they were both asking him where the man had come from and what he was driving. Chris had no clue what they were talking about. It turns out that Chris didn't see anything or anyone outside the entire time. No car had pulled in or even parked on the road, and he never saw a soul walking around the building or into the store. This really got all 3 of them scared. Apparently this store wasn't in the middle of nowhere, but there wasn't a ton around it either, so it was pretty unlikely someone would walk in at night like that. And since Chris had been outside the whole time with a view of the road and the parking lot, it seemed like the guy had literally come out of nowhere. All three of them ended up talking about it until closing time, and even more the next day, trying to figure out who the guy was and where he could have come from. Chris kept saying he was an alien trying to blend in with our population, and it was funny at first, but then Alan got a little obsessed with that thought. Since he had been the only one to see the guy up close and face to face, he actually started to think it really was some kind of alien or human hybrid that came into the store. Everything about the man he saw was abnormal, and the handful of tiny metallic pyramids only added to that theory. I could tell by the way he talked about it that it genuinely affected him. He kind of wrapped up the story by telling me that even though it had happened so many years ago, he could still picture the guy's face perfectly. And before we moved on with other subjects and work that night, he looked at me dead serious and said that he honestly thinks the guy wasn't human. When Alan said that, it sent chills through my entire body, and it was a way scarier story than I thought it was going to be. I have to say, hearing him tell it to me in person like that made me almost certain he wasn't making it up.